What if we've been radically misunderstanding the earliest known Christian building? At Dura-Europos, a city on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire, archaeologists uncovered what's often called the earliest known Christian church. For decades, it's been described as a humble house church, evidence, some say, of secret gatherings during times of persecution. Others have pointed to Dura-Europos as proof that Christians never actually met in ordinary homes at all, that the so-called house church is a modern myth. New research is telling a different story. In this episode, I sit down with Dr. Cammille Leon Angelo to explore how 3D reconstructions and light simulations reveal that this building wasn't just a modified home. Join us as we uncover the real truth behind the world's earliest known Christian building. How are you doing today, Dr. Leon Angelo?
I'm doing so well, and I'm so excited to be here with you and think through this new research with you all.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So, just to show everybody my fancy PowerPoint I made, here we have fun pictures. So, like, this is a site, and it's got all these different artwork and all this like really fun stuff just to look at in general. But you wrote a essentially a peer-reviewed journal article arguing some really fascinating, interesting stuff. So could you just give us just some really summarizing, just really quick, maybe 5 minutes on what you argued for, why it was so important, the significance of this discussion today?
Yeah, I would love to. So the article appeared in the Journal of Roman Archaeology. It was co-authored between myself and my colleague Joshua Silver. And the thrust of the article is to look at what we have at Dura-Europos in terms of the Christian remains. This is the Christian building at Dura-Europos is the earliest securely dated Christian building we have. And it's significant because it's been typically understood as a house church or a domus ecclesiae. And it's this idea for a long time in scholarship, scholars have understood it as this kind of link, right? To link the unadapted homes that folks worshiped in the New Testament through to these like larger basilicas we get in the 4th and 5th century after Constantine legalizes Christianity. How do you explain how we get from these homes in the New Testament to these big buildings? And scholars posited that there must be some kind of pseudo-domestic space that linked the two. So when the Christian building at Dura-Europos was discovered, scholars were like, oh, that's it. That's the missing link. And they drew this kind of teleological model between the two. And it's been part of this larger narrative of, oh, we have these pseudo-domestic spaces that link these two architectural forms. At the time that Dura's Christian building was discovered, there was a hypothesis that there were many other of these so-called house churches or domus ecclesiae that existed in the years prior to Constantine legalizing Christianity. But in the about 100 and so years since, all the other examples have been redated. So really, Dura's Christian building is the only securely dated pre-Constantinian Christian building. Now, this is significant because it has been this like one cornerstone that scholars have hung their hats on, that we have these kind of pseudo-domestic spaces. And what our article is challenging is actually maybe this space wasn't that domestic at all. And if we question how domestic Dura's Christian building is and how it would have been understood, then maybe we don't actually have this link between these homes in the New Testament and these basilicas. Maybe we have to re-theorize the origins, the material origins of Christianity, of early Christianity, of pre-Constantinian Christianity. And why, and then it also raises some larger questions about why we are so primed and wanting to see these like this pseudo-domestic intermediary. Why do we want to understand Christians as a uniquely domestic peoples, really? Their worship is uniquely domestic in this period. And I can talk more about that too later on. So what we do is we reconceive of the Christian building as uniquely as not uniquely domestic, but in fact really part and parcel of this larger religious landscape at Dura-Europos.
That is really, really fascinating. So this is going to be a really fun interview, and it makes a lot of sense why your work made some headlines there. All right, so could you just briefly describe what Dura-Europos is? So
Yeah,
I guess that includes the entire site as
yeah,
well as the specifically the Christian building as well.
yeah. So Dura-Europos is a site in Syria, in modern day Syria, and it was founded after in some years after the Alexander the Great's conquest. So the Christian building is from the last years of the site, but really we have, a site that exists centuries before. So it has not a well-attested Hellenistic phase,
Hmm.
and then you have Parthenon and Roman phases that come after. And what's significant about the site is a few things. So in the Roman period, it becomes this Roman garrison, but prior to that, you have a lot of, and up and through the Roman garrison phases, you have a lot of intercultural interactions. So the site, as we can see in this overview, is kind of high up topographically, and
Mhm.
you can see that it's overlooking the Euphrates River. You've got the kind of ridge you can see, you've got city walls, so it's quite high up and it's contained. And within this site, you get many different religions. So you have many different temples, like the Temple of Bel. You've also got later on a synagogue and a Mithraeum, that's a temple to the god of Mithras, and then Christianity. So you have all of these religions living together and all of these languages. So you've got Greek, Latin, Syriac, for example. So you have this really interreligious, intercultural landscape. Now, Dura-Europos is also significant because it trades with the town down the road called Palmyra, which is this well-known caravan site as well. So you have these major interactions here, and it's kind of a site positioned at the edge of an empire, right? So it's right at the edge of the Roman Empire. So you get some really interesting interactions between East and West happening as well. So for all of these reasons, it's a really significant site culturally. But what scholars love about it is it's often called Pompeii of the desert or Pompeii of the East because of the quality of preservation. So towards the end of the site's years, this is in the 250s, essentially a large chunk of the site was fortified, and in fortifying it, they sealed part of the site off under a large rampart. And this meant that many of the buildings that were sealed under this rampart, this will include the Christian building, the synagogue, and the Mithraeum, were basically hermetically sealed so that nothing touched them, which was amazing for preservation. And then the site, at the time it was sieged by the Sasanians around sometime between 254, 256 CE, it is unoccupied, right? It is deserted and unoccupied again. So you don't have this kind of layers of successive constructions that would typically compromise an archaeological site. So what is preserved at Dura-Europos is of a far greater quality than what we have normally in the ancient world. So it becomes this really beautiful kind of picture of a city caught in time, just as Pompeii is, right, that was coated with a volcano. So for scholars, this becomes quite an interesting case study for how we understand a city in the ancient world. Now, the Christian building is one of many religious buildings at the city. What's really interesting about the Christian building is that it was a private home that around in the first half of the 3rd century was adapted into a building used for Christian community use. This narrative also, though, and we have a great photo of it here, this idea that it is a uniquely domestic structure is also undermined by the fact that the synagogue and the Mithraeum, for instance, were also private homes that over the course of some decades were architecturally adapted for community worship use. So you can see the synagogue, for instance, where you have this incredible, let's go back to that photo, right? You have this incredible room, you've got this Torah shrine, you've got these photos, these paintings, right? Largely of scenes from the Hebrew Bible. The Mithraeum, for instance, similarly, you have a room that becomes the cult of Mithras, right? This starts within one room of a house, excuse me, and then it kind of expands to overtake a large section of what was a private home. These kind of successive adaptations of private homes into community worship space is a cornerstone of the religious material landscape at Dura-Europos. And you have often these places that are very, as you can see with the synagogue, very richly illustrated. Even in this photo, you can see on the ceiling where we have ceiling tiles as well, with some of them are images of fruit, some of them are portraits, right? So this very kind of visually rich landscape as well that gives us this snapshot into religious life in the 3rd century in a Roman town.
That's pretty incredible. So you did mention the idea of a rampart. So that they basically, if I'm understanding right, they filled it with sand and debris just to make it a bigger wall.
So not quite. So the rampart's really interesting. So
Okay.
first of all, what you have is as the Sasanians are ramping up an area, what the Roman army does is they take the western part of the site, the western wall of the site, is particularly vulnerable because it's the one edge of the site that is more topographically accessible. So essentially, they start by adding material to make sure that the wall can't be breached, and then eventually bring debris in from other parts of the site, sealing it right down over the buildings to create this kind of extra secure area. And putting that whole kind of side of the site out of use. So it becomes this seal over it to basically to secure the western edge of the site.
Very fascinating. And just from the picture, where is the western edge?
Western edge of the site is on this photo would be to the right uppermost corner. You can see that there's not a wadi on each end, and it's not by the Euphrates, so it was seen as especially vulnerable.
Thank you for explaining that. That makes a lot of sense. Alrighty, so that's kind of like the main site in general, and kind of how we've preserved that. What
and
about?
If I can add one more thing?
Yeah.
So what's really interesting about Dura-Europos in this religious landscape is that the synagogue, Mithraeum, and Christian building were actually all located on the same street. You can see that really clearly here, and they're located against the western edge of the site. So you can see that they're they all kind of open onto the same street, which was Wall Street, which also helps us understand kind of a particular kind of spatial rhetoric for these religious sites, for these religious buildings at the site.
Interesting. Okay, so you're saying there's a specific reason why these were kind of on the edge?
No, I think what we can see is that and we'll come to this a little bit more, but I think what scholars have tended to do when they have looked at, for instance, the Christian building or the synagogue, is they have tended to see these buildings translocally. So they'll look at all of the early synagogues together, or all of our early Christian buildings together, but not really what do religious buildings at the site at large look like. So they'll go for kind of a translocal model rather than a locally situated model. And in our work, we can talk more about this, take a really hyper locally situated model to understand both what house space and what religious space look like at Dura-Europos. Because I think when we do that, we don't see these sites so out of context. We're not imposing kind of categories of domestic or cult onto them, but understanding them in their kind of local vernacular.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. And so let's talk about, before we get into, well, I might as well. Okay. The Dura-Europos quote unquote house church. Could you talk about when that was discovered, when that was used, and just the general facts about the church?
Yeah. So the Christian building was discovered at Dura-Europos in the 1930s. And it was discovered first, they thought they were kind of just excavating a house. And then around the 5th season, they found these paintings in a room with Christian scenes. And this room, which you can see if we go back one photo, the room where you have that kind of arch on the right corner of your, right in there, yeah. And they found it over this kind of like font. And it became clear that this was probably a Christian cultic space. And the importance of this was immediately recognizable to the archaeologists who knew how rare it was to find Christian material from this period, right? Because Dura-Europos was hermetically sealed, right, under this rampart, we have a secure date for the site. We know that it was out of use by 256 CE. We know that it was a pre-Constantinian site. So this kind of, the discovery of pre-Constantinian Christian material was significant. Now, originally, there was some speculation that this room might have been a martyrium, that is used for the kind of, used to house the remains of martyrs. That was quickly called into question because the basin that you're looking at had some waterproofed plaster that was pretty consistent with what you would find at Dura's baths, Roman baths, right? So it was pretty clear that this room had been waterproof for something. So a lot of scholars, myself included, are far more partial. Very few now think that this was ever a martyrium. Far more likely was that this was a baptismal font, right? So there would have been, this is what the photo we're looking at here is a reconstruction that was once housed in the Yale Art Gallery. It's no longer reconstructed this way, but you have this kind of room at the back of the house or the back of the building, and it's been outfitted for baptism. So you have wall paintings, these kind of richly adorned wall paintings. Yes, this is the women who are maybe going to a tomb, maybe they're initiates. There's debate over this. We can talk more about this. You have on the walls these kind of Christian paintings with Christian scenes, and then into a baptismal font. And then above the font, if you might go back for me, Zach, above the font, you have a painting of the Good Shepherd, right? So you have a picture of a man with a herd of sheep, and you also have what was a later addition, a detail of Adam and Eve in the bottom left corner. So you have this very clearly, these are the earliest examples of Christian wall paintings that we have. And you can see that addition of Adam and Eve in the left corner there, it's very faint.
Yeah.
So it became clear that this was like the synagogue in the Mithraeum, a building, a private house that had been undergone numerous adaptations to accommodate Christian community use. And if we can go to that figure from my article, Zach, I can walk through some of these changes. Okay, now this is a schematic plan, right? We're looking at something overhead. But on the left, you have what was the private house, the layout of the private house. And on the right, you have the building as it was adapted. And I'll just walk you all through some of these changes. So this might not look significant from the schematic renders, but as our article has shown, these changes made big differences. So you'll see that the wall between room 4B and 4A was removed, and you created one large assembly hall. And 4A was significant because it was the dining room of the house, right? So you have these benches around where people would have reclined as they dined facing into each other. You have then in 4 a huge room there was a podium then at one end. Yes, exactly. And what was really interesting to us, and we can talk a little more about this, but the whole room was the benches removed, and the room, a packed earth surface was put down, and it was kind of slanted. So you have this big room designed to welcome a lot of people. You also have a restructuring of entrances and exits within the space. So for instance, we'll get to this. So if room 6, as we talked about, becomes the baptistry, the door between room 6 and 5 at the entrance to 5, right on the 5 side, if that makes sense, gets totally kind of, for lack of a better word, pimped out. It becomes much more intricate of an entrance because it's probably being used in some kind of ceremonial way, right? This is an entrance they expect people to move through. for Dura's houses, it was very uncommon for interior doorways to receive uh, this kind of exaggerated treatment. Typically, the doors within houses are left pretty unadorned. So there's clearly a movement between, as we argue in the article, room 4 into room 5 into room 6, most likely. You also have a restructuring of what spaces and how they're used. So prior to the adaptation, you had a court that was, this is an outdoor kind of court open to the sun. It had a mud surface. There was a cistern in the corner. And then once the building gets converted for Christian community use around in the 240s, the court is tile surface is put down, a stone surface is put down. The cistern becomes inaccessible. And there's benches put around the side of the court to accommodate more seating. So clearly there's more people that are sitting there, right? So most of what we know about these adaptations happen towards this kind of back half of the house or Christian building. And that's in part just because the nature of the preservation. The building was much better preserved to the left of the court than to the right. Now there's questions about, and we can talk a little more about this, but as our work shows, there's also the way the entrances and exits operate and the way that windows are added also show us that there's a difference in movement around the building. Now, this is significant because what happens after, as our article shows, what happens after the building was renovated for Christian community use is that its features actually are not that common with Dura's houses. So what we've done in our article is we look at what are the qualities that make up a Roman house, okay? So what features and in what arrangements, what features appear in Roman houses and in what kind of arrangements? So for instance, in your house today, Zach, you might have a staircase. A school may also have a staircase, but you might have a staircase and a bedroom, right? Unlikely that a school has a staircase and a bedroom. They might have a staircase and a classroom, but you might not have a classroom, right? So we can't look at features in isolation. We have to look at them together. So what we try to do is, what are the features that the excavators originally kind of noted across houses? And there wasn't that much that the excavations were done in the 1920s and 30s, so they weren't as we would do them today. But they did know pretty consistently whether houses had wall paintings or pictorial graffiti, courtyard staircases, and cisterns. So we took those features and we did a statistical analysis across our data set. And what we found is that after the renovations to the Christian building, it had a courtyard staircase, wall paintings, but no cistern. That arrangement is actually not attested to in any other Roman house at Dura. So these kind of features, these arrangements would have been really dissonant. What people saw at the Christian building would not have registered, we argue, to them as domestic, right? This is totally dissonant with what domestic architecture is. But if we're just kind of looking at these top plans, we miss that because scholars hadn't thought really critically about actually what constitutes domestic space at Dura-Europos. That, in combination with the fact that it would seem that the conversion into the Christian building deprived the Christian building of any kind of kitchen facility, right? So you couldn't kind of carry out your everyday life functions, also very telling. So these kind of pivots make a big difference in how local folks would have understood their building.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding you correctly, so the previous building had something like a cistern and some other things like, specifically a place to make food, essentially, things that you would think of as in a house. And then the renovations happened and, well, it's not there. So in that case, it's like, well, it's not a house anymore, right?
Exactly. But figuring out what exactly is a house to an ancient person is a really complicated question, right? Because our understanding of what constitutes particular types of spaces is really culturally situated. So if we're imposing models of like what constitutes a house space to us, onto the ancient world, it becomes problematic. So what we were trying to show is actually this idea that Dura's Christian building, as I should back up and say, scholars have thought that Dura's Christian building still maintains lots of trappings of its domestic antecedent, that it would have been clearly domestic to the people that were hanging out in there. But when we did this kind of like, oh, actually, if we look really closely at what constitutes domestic space, and this is, we can't find another comparanda for this, this is unique within this city space, then it becomes much harder to imagine that the people that were using this space understood it as domestic, rather than much more closely resembling other cultic spaces that we have at the site, right? So this idea, if you go to the baptistry where you have kind of floor to wall didactic wall paintings of scenes from the lives of, like, so here we have life of Jesus and certain, like the healing of a paralytic, walking on water, right? These miracle stories. In the synagogue, we have also didactic stories from the lives of, a biblical text. In the Mithraeum, we have these images of the life of Mithras, right? So this kind of didactic use of wall paintings, very striking. Also, if you go back to the Yale reconstruction, the Yale reconstruction from the Yale Art Gallery with the baptismal font for a moment.
That?
Oh, no, the one where you have the wall paintings and the...
Oh, okay, sorry.
No worries, we're good. Okay, so you can see here, you've got this starry sky on the ceiling, right? And then above the baptismal font, that's a motif we also have within the Mithraeum and the synagogue. So this kind of the taking of cues from other forms of sacred space rather than domestic space is really interesting. The kind of both this move away from the functions and form of domestic space and then taking cues from other sacred spaces we have. It's pretty drastic at the site.
Fascinating. So just for more clarity there, so do you think the people that were using this as some type of Christian building would have been like, hey, this looks like it used to be a house, but we're not really using it as a house anymore?
I actually think that this would have registered almost entirely as a Christian sacred space with very little concern for the domestic antecedent. Almost every sacred space we have at Dura-Europos was once a private home that underwent adaptation. This has nothing, so the features that comprised domestic space at Dura do not appear in the same arrangement at the Christian building. But also what our article showed is that there's a restructuring of how bodies move through the space and the times that these rooms would have been used for. And that looks also very different than it did when the building was used as a private home. So this kind of, I think it's really interesting to think about the temporality of when we, when we occupy space. We can even think about this, like maybe you go to the office. You probably do that between the hours of 9 to 5 mostly, right? It's just like in the ancient world, when you can occupy a space and how you occupy it, how you move within it, it's kind of like the patterns of movement also inform how we understand a space.
Awesome. Alrighty. And so would that be a good time to talk about those like the light?
Yeah, I would love to.
Okay.
So
yeah, let's pull it up.
So for instance, so this is just a schematic render, but if we can go to the other figures 8, maybe from the article, or here, this is great too. So this is a view of the courtyard of the Christian building before it was adapted. And then we have the next photo will be after it was adapted. Great, and you can see this insertion of windows, but you can also, as I mentioned, the courtyard was tiled over. And what this meant is that because it was no longer a packed earth surface, but a tile surface, a limestone tile surface, this reflects light much more intensely into the rooms. At the same time, there's this insertion of windows throughout the building that also convey that the way that light would have flowed through the space would have been categorically different. So as you can see, just that you're getting a little bit more light flowing off the courtyard floor, but into the buildings and into the entrances. But if we can go then to perhaps figure 7 from the article, I think you had, yep, so 7A. So here we've done a yearly illuminance simulation, right? So you can see how contained natural light is in particular areas of the building, right? So the dining room, super brightly lit, right? You get this kind of intense illumination off the entrance. And then you've got this kind of light, kind of soft lighting around the benches. The rooms that open off the courtyard, right? Intense lighting. But then you also have quite dark rooms for the room to the left of the dining room or to the right. Yes, very dark. Then what happens with this kind of insertion of windows and also taking down of the wall, if you may, we'll go to 7B, is light operates totally differently. You can see that there's a greater portion, a greater number of rooms, and a greater portion of those rooms that are brightly illuminated. You also have an insertion of windows that mean that bodies can be that people can regulate the movement, for instance, of bodies between rooms and the courtyard much more easily as well. So what we argue is that the limitations to the space would have been far less, right? You can use, without having additional artificial sources of light like oil lamps, etc. Just the natural light means these rooms are being occupied in a different way, or can be occupied in a different way. But what we also show, for instance, is that, and I don't think we have the photos here, but when we do look at particular times of light, when we do the light modeling for, let's say, the late afternoon, what we found is that prior to adaptation, light was contained within the dining room. You had this kind of beautiful, nice illumination around the benches where people were sitting. But what we found was you also, at particular times, instead of getting that kind of nice seated formation where bodies are directed to face each other, in the assembly hall, you get a spotlight right over the podium at particular times of the day with this creation of 2 windows. So whoever was standing maybe on that podium, bodies are directed in a unilaterally kind of axial way to face the person at the podium. And you even have this kind of slanting of the floor that further enables this. So the formation that bodies take in this space looks completely different after it was renovated.
Fascinating. Okay, so just for some clarity here, so
Yeah.
so how did you know, like, what did you say? You like, we can tell when, like, they were at the podium? Is that what you're saying?
We can look at, for instance, when we figured out, and I'm just trying to pull up my slides here. So we have,
I can pull up the paper on the screen.
Yeah, no, we're good. So you have a dais at the end of the room, and in the late afternoon, when previously in the late afternoon, you had this kind of internal lighting around the benches, right? So it flowed off the courtyard, and then you had this kind of soft lighting, bodies faced this way, right, as they reclined. In the late afternoon, after the building is renovated, you get a really nice spotlight over, this is a yearly illuminance simulation that you have on the screen, but we also in our paper have images of what this looked like in the late afternoon. You have this perfect spotlight kind of over this dais. So it's really strategically done in a way, right? So who's ever standing there is spotlit nicely, and you have bodies kind of facing what we imagine would be bodies facing that podium that's now kind of spotlit. So you have this much more kind of axial formation of bodies rather than a kind of bodies facing each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you're saying is that the light was specifically positioned like the way they did the renovation so that at certain times there would be a bunch of light where the podium was, and we can tell like that's how it kind of was used that way.
I think that this is very likely. And what is specifically very interesting to me is the way in which the dais is actually a little bit off center. So it's not positioned smack dab against the east wall in the middle, but it's actually a little bit towards, you can see towards the courtyard. And this is because the light flow, like the spotlight really functions there. It doesn't function a little bit over. So I think there was a lot of intentionality in inserting those windows on the west wall to light a very specific thing. But why this is significant is because what we argue in the article is that bodies did not occupy this space in the same way they normally would occupy a house, right? That they took different forms of assembly. And that's important because the way we embody a space, the way we position our bodies, actually is part of how we make meaning in that space. This is why it's normal to sit in rows, right, when you're in a classroom, but it's kind of weird to do that at home. You sit at a dining room table, you don't sit in little desks in rows, right? So how we position bodies also registers to us about how we understand our spaces.
Yeah. And this is also important because there, at some point, there was some idea that, like, even after these renovations, it was kind of used like a house, but also a
Right. So
church. Is that right?
there's been lots of speculation. First of all, there's been a really kind of stronghold that this building must be pseudo-domestic, must have had some trappings of domestic space. And part of the reason this is because there has been a long-held narrative about Christians needing to have worshipped in domestic spaces in the years before Constantine legalized Christianity, Emperor Constantine among other emperors, but yes, before the legalization of Christianity, because Christians were persecuted. And that this kind of domestic facade would have given Christians protection against persecution. They needed to worship in secrecy. They needed to meet in secrecy. This becomes challenging to uphold if actually there was nothing really differentiating Dura's Christian building from any other community cult space. That there was nothing distinctly domestic or actually even domestic about the space once it was renovated. So it really challenges this idea of Christians at Dura, which we have no evidence for, but as like an example of kind of domestic worship to protect against persecution. So this idea of Christians as a uniquely domestic kind of spatially domestic religion in the years before Constantine has been really deeply intertwined with narratives of widespread Christian martyrdom. This is a problematic narrative. Now, the question, you had a second part of this question though, Zach, and I'm now
I can't remember.
Oh, no, it's okay. Okay. So I think this is partly why it really matters. Oh, the question of whether people actually live there. So as part of this idea of this being a domestic space, there's the question of whether this space continued to serve any kind of domestic functionality. And what we do in our article, so there's been two arguments for this domestic functionality. Now, if you might go back to that reconstruction that's not mine, but that you had, it's like a sepia one.
Yeah. Don't want to associate your name with that.
No, I don't love this one, but we're going to talk through it because it's helpful for a second. So now there have been two arguments for the continued domestic occupation of the site after it was renovated. Now, the first one we fully disprove in our article. So as you can see, the baptistry looks like it was cross-sectioned. So originally this room was a full height. And then when the font was put in, they did two things. So they cross-sectioned the room. They kind of, if you can imagine like a drop ceiling almost. So they inserted the font and then they put a drop ceiling that cross-sectioned the room. So this room had considerably lower ceiling height than the rest of the building. Now, originally when the site was published, there was speculation that about this upper room, and maybe this upper room held like a clergy member might have slept there. This becomes totally unlikely for a number of reasons. Foremost, in our article we show, this floor, once the ceiling is dropped, that creates this kind of upper room, right? And then the fonts below it, this subsection, if you're following me. So room 6, and then what they call room 6B, this kind of area in the space above the drop ceiling. That floor/ceiling could not have structurally supported any kind of human occupation. It was not securely attached to the different parts of the wall enough to make it structurally stable. So any kind of movement on that floor would have damaged that beautiful starry ceiling that we saw earlier at the top of the baptistry. It would have basically cracked it. There was no way for that to have supported any kind of human occupation. It wasn't even reinforced and fastened to part. It was like force fit on one side, so really structurally unstable. The other argument for continued occupation, which we cannot prove or disprove, is that there was so in Roman Syria, you have seasonal occupation of roofs, right? Of all roofs, you have flat roofs of these houses. Now, what's interesting though is that you have a locking mechanism from internally within the stairway. So even to get up there, if you're up there, you can lock the door so that folks couldn't always get up the stairs to be at the courtyard anyway. So maybe people slept on the roof, but we don't have any evidence of that. And it does seem that the roofs, that kind of courtyard, rooftop access was actually could be regulated pretty tightly. So, but in that same case, you would have the same argument could be made about the synagogue, for instance, and their roof too. It's all the same roofs, but we don't have any. It seems highly unlikely that anyone was continuing to live in the building, given that there's no cistern access, there's no kitchen access, and you could lock the door up to the roof from the inside. Unlikely. And that would have only been seasonal, because in certain seasons you would not have been able to facilitate that.
So just for clarity, so there is a second level, but it's like outdoor, is that right?
So there's not, this is challenging. Okay, so there is a roof, and there was a staircase that you could access the roof to. Okay, you could access the roof from. So if you look at stairs to the upper floor is a misnomer. There is not an upper floor at Dura. There is a stairs to the roof, and there was a question of whether there was an upper floor above the baptistry. Which is not in total, what we've proven is totally implausible, because that was not actually a floor. That was basically a drop ceiling that was not structurally stable. And there's no evidence there was even windows up there, so there would have been no ventilation either. So it's both structurally unstable and suffocating. You could think of it almost like the opposite. Maybe you have a crawl space under your house. It's similar to that, but on top of a room. So there was no upper story. Excavators thought maybe there could have been, but then when you do the kind of structural calculations for what would have, it just doesn't hold up.
Yeah. Okay. What about like a really small child?
So it's plastered, and then you have these like reed mats, and then also logs that aren't actually fastened. So even like you would have put a foot through. Like, I have a hard time even believing a very, very small child wouldn't crack the thing, because it wasn't even fastened to the other materials. Like that, it was entirely to create an aesthetic choice, which was this beautiful ceiling.
So it's still possible that maybe like a really irresponsible parent let their child sleep up there, theoretically.
They would have ended up probably destroying that. Like if the kid moved that much,
maybe just like a little bit, a very calm child, maybe
like a rat, like a small animal.
They had a pet, a nice little pet. Just kidding.
Yeah, but it was not structurally stable.
Okay.
The child may have fallen through. I don't.
Well, we would see evidence of that, wouldn't we? So, yeah. Darn. Well, that throws out the whole sleeping child idea. Sorry, guys.
I mean, maybe there. I mean, I don't know how small children come, so perhaps, but yeah.
It was a long time ago. The children were different. So let's see here. All right. So we kind of talked about when it was used this way, what time range, and so hypothetically, like, is it like 15 years that it was used this way?
Yeah. So what's crazy? So there's very little. So we have very little dating. So we know exactly when the site went out of use, between 254 and 256 CE for sure. The dating for the Christian building internally within the building is a little more suspect. So the building is believed, the original private house is imagined to have been constructed sometime in the 230s, early 230s. Then maybe about a decade later, it was renovated. The question of its original construction is a little bit suspect, also because it's based on an inscription in an undercoat of plaster that becomes a little more suspect. But generally, because of how little use it seems like that private home underwent, the general thinking is that it probably wasn't in use that long before it was renovated. And we don't know anything about the original owners of the private home. We don't know if they were Christians. We don't know if they donated the building. We don't know if the building was abandoned,
Hmm.
right? Like, we don't have any evidence for what happened in that private home really before it was renovated.
Hmm.
Um,
But we do
so
know when it was renovated.
we suspect it
Generally.
was around, yeah, around the
Okay.
early 240s.
Yeah, that's really important because people might want to say, "Hey, this house was used this way, and therefore maybe other places were used this way at the same time." But if the time is just very close to that time where everything was destroyed, then you really can't bring that back that much. If that
Right,
makes any
and I think
sense.
what's really important is that we only have one other content right now. So Dura-Europos' Christian building, as I can say this enough, is the only securely dated Christian building, only securely dated Christian building we have prior to Constantine. There has been one other recent-ish argument for a Christian building that may have been a pre-Constantinian Christian building, and that is at Megiddo. The dating from that building is highly, highly suspect for a number of reasons, in that most of the dating material is stylistic. The numismatic and ceramic evidence, that's coin evidence and ceramic evidence, does not come from sealed context, right? So it's on top of like the mosaic floor. So it hasn't, scholars are generally pretty cautious about accepting as early of a date as certain folks have pushed for that building. But Megiddo is kind of a similar situation to Dura in that we've got a Roman garrison there. We've got, a multicultural city. So interestingly, if we're finding I think what's interesting is this early, even after Constantine, this early articulation of Christian space. What I think we can say from sites like Megiddo and sites like Dura-Europos is that communities are taking their cues from their local communities, and that they're developing a Christian spatial syntax in conversation with their local community and local understandings of sacred space.
Fascinating. So maybe this is just nonsense. You tell me. But I thought that there was a site at Capernaum that people. I think it's like right under Peter's
Yeah.
house
Yeah.
or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Any idea what that's
Yeah.
about?
So there is a house around the synagogue at Capernaum. It is a first century house. Does that mean it belonged to an apostle? No. Is there any reason to believe it was associated with an apostle? No.
Okay. All right.
So this is something that we
Uh,
like to do
yeah.
with houses too. We like to assign owners just because we know someone frequented an area and that we have a house from the period that someone was in that area does not mean it was their house, right? Do you know what I'm saying? So to assign claims of
Right.
ownership, there's nothing linking it, but it is really great for tourism to be able to make that argument. But really, it's a house from the time of an apostle. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, it makes perfect sense.
Okay.
So I'll pull it up. It's okay if you're not prepared to talk about this, but I'm really curious if we can cut this out if we need to. You can be like, maybe I'm not prepared to talk about this, but I just wanted to ask you about it while we're at it because this is I don't know who Rittmeyer is. Supposedly an archaeologist. He says
Mhm.
the Capernaum House Church. So he and basically like it
I mean, are they
there's
saying it's a
several different
house church?
plasters and walls on the floor. Uh, it's got beneath the plastered floor the usual repertoire of domestic vessels such as cooking pots, bowls, juglets was found. And then it says until the 4th century, the population of Capernaum was entirely Jewish.
Mhm.
And then apparently there's some renovations. So you're not aware of anything like this.
So I think he's saying it looks like the date they're putting is in the 4th century.
So that's what part of the site is, but apparently there were some renovations.
In the 4th century, yeah.
No,
So okay.
before that actually.
So show me the
Let me see if I can find it. Once again, we can edit
yeah,
this.
I haven't looked over this. I have been to what they call the House of Peter at Capernaum, and what they have when I was there on display was a 1st century house.
Interesting.
They were not making the museum there was not making an argument for its functionality as a Christian community space
Hmm.
or its renovations.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, we can
I'm
read it
not
here.
familiar with this work here. It looks like it's not been peer reviewed.
That is
Uh,
correct.
yeah, so I see the plan of the Peter's late first century house, which is what I'm familiar with.
Yeah. So
Uh,
it says the first stage began in the second half, or perhaps even at the end of the first half of the first century, where
mhm,
the east courtyard transformed into a large room and something like a central wooden beam placed on the walls divided the two parts. So if you so this room in the middle here, it
mhm,
has it was plastered,
mhm.
and there were let me see if I could find it.
Okay, so
Underneath the renovation, there were like pots, bowls, so like it looks like it was a house. And then on top of the renovation, which is supposedly at the end of the first century or somewhere
mhm,
around there, it says there's only storage jars and oil lamps discovered.
okay, so I'm not familiar with what data or excavation reports they're drawing on. Here's what are the questions I would ask as an archaeologist. First and foremost,
Hmm.
does the change in functionality, so they're describing what they're describing here. First of all, how is this date? How are they dating the renovations? Number one. Number two, okay, so we've got what they're describing, which I'm not sure happened based on, let me be clear, I don't know what they're pulling from. This isn't what I am familiar with.
Yeah.
But if you, just because you have uh, certain vessels, a change in vessels, right, a plastering of a floor, and then a different use, does not
Mhm.
mean it does not mean that it's being changed from, let's say, a domestic use into a Christian community space, right? What they're describing as storage jars, that can mean a whole myriad of things, right? You could have a shop, for instance. So this question of what makes up a community space, I think is really interesting. What we can definitely attest to at Dura-Europos is that there's a large amount of community happening there.
Mhm.
They're gathering, and they're gathering at particular times, and there seems to be a particular kind of ritualized function to their movements around a space. That I buy, right? Like there's inscriptions where we mention God in heaven, we've got a cross, we've got some Jesus stuff happening. All of those
Mhm.
things would support this functioning as a Christian community space. What was just described to me at Capernaum, again, not even knowing if that is at all factual, maybe it is a replastering of a floor and then different kinds of vessels happening on top. That does not point to me in any direction of a community space yet. I would need a lot more evidence to get me to the point where it seems like this is a building renovated for Christian community use at this period.
Mm.
That doesn't, I mean, that doesn't mean that Christians didn't gather in houses in the area of Capernaum, right? Or people that are part of this nascent Christian movement. But do we have a structure that suggests that is a where we can securely say that this was a Christian community who adapted a structure for their use or built a structure for their use? And I don't see
Mhm.
that description that you just read to me. I don't see that yet, but maybe, I mean, I'm always someone that can be convinced, but these were the questions I'd be asking.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question there. So, my thoughts are like the plastering. So, it seems like the article's like, hey, you got some lamps. Lamps are used for religious use, right? Pots are used for religious use. And then the
Well, lamps are
plaster,
used
well,
by everyone, not just, I mean, you have to have light in
you're
the
right.
world.
That's
Everyone has
fair.
lamps, not just religious. There's
Okay.
that's no, let's
Yeah.
start there. Everyone needs a lamp. That's
You
like,
know, yeah.
yeah. So lamps are ubiquitous. We find them everywhere. We can find them in religious contexts, but we also find them in like if you excavate a village, you can find hundreds of lamp fragments.
That's really funny because in today's age, right,
Yeah,
we're not going to use lamps for normal use.
yeah, no, but right, you need light sources, especially
Yeah.
if you don't have like a brightly lit. I mean, at Dura, we have a peristyle house, right? So you have light coming in from a lot of different angles. But if you're in a dimly lit space, you're going to use a lamp.
Mhm. Right.
Um,
And Uh, I was gonna ask, and then what about the plaster? Because the plaster, that sounds real special. Like, why would you plaster
Oh,
a
so yeah,
house?
so things are plastered all the time in the ancient world. So especially plaster floors are really common in the first century. This is not unusual, and this is not restricted to religious use.
Hmm.
So higher income, like higher socioeconomic houses often have plastered surfaces, either plastered walls or plastered floors. And you have plaster is something that happens in succession. So you always often find multiple layers of plaster over the course of a building's use. Um,
Hmm.
this is not at all restricted to any particular kind of religious building. It happens in civic buildings, it happens in military buildings. Yeah.
Fascinating. All right. Well, my curiosity has been
No,
exercised.
I'm now gonna have to go read this study and find out what's going on there. But yeah,
Oh,
that
you think too much. You think there's a study.
okay. Well, but it's I mean, right now I mean, it's been over 10 years since I've been at Capernaum.
Yeah.
But they had a first century house that they wanted to associate with, I think, was it Peter? Yeah, Peter and
Hmm.
Andrew maybe. But the other reconstruction you were describing to me is news to me, and I
Well,
read a lot of this
yeah.
stuff. Yeah, so I think what I'd like to add is that I think what's important is when we think about the origins of Christianity and how we imagine uh, Christians having gathered together and having worshiped together and what their spaces look like, is that we resist kind of imagining imposing our own categories onto the evidence. That Dura really seems to be the only example, the only pre-Constantinian example of a Christian worship space. And just because it was adapted from a private home into a Christian worship space does not make it uniquely domestic and does not mean we can say Christianity in the time before Constantine was a uniquely domestic phenomenon.
Hmm.
What we should say about Dura, and what I think people need to look at Dura's Christian building as an example of, is that Christians took their cues from their local spaces, from other local sacred spaces. They were part and parcel of a local landscape. And if we want to imagine what Christianity looked like at a different town at this time, we're going to have to look at what their other sacred spaces look like and maybe hypothesize based on that.
Hmm.
But this
Thank you.
idea that this is Dura's Christian building is representative of a larger picture of pre-Constantinian Christianity translocally is a problematic narrative. And the idea that we can say anything about the relationship between martyrdom and persecution and Christian domestic space in the time before Constantine, also really a problematic link. So what we do in this article effectively is sever both of those ideas. As Christianity, pre-Constantinian Christianity is a uniquely domestic phenomenon and one uniquely governed by persecution.
Mm.
And I think this is a larger issue, is that we don't necessarily need to be doing a Christian archaeology of this time, but of a local archaeology and really understanding what constitutes different types of spaces. So that would be my big takeaway. And the other thing is, and I'm happy to talk about this, but also the Christian building has received so much attention prior to our work, received so much attention for the wall paintings and what the wall paintings tell us about early Christianity. And on one hand, these are incredible, amazing, important pieces, yes, and really speak to this didactic use of paintings. But on the other, there was so much more evidence that we went back and kind of reclaimed and thought about. And I think so often when we talk about the origins of Christianity, we want to focus on the prettiest things, right? The things that allow us to tell a narrative, the thing that links us back to biblical stories, right? What were Christians thinking? What were Christians teaching? What were Christians reading? And that's really important work, but it's also so important that we do that within a spatialized setting. So we're understanding how these were viewed, when they were viewed, what are the pathways of movement to them, right? These larger questions. So I'm so glad you brought these up. And I hope that everyone has a chance to see them at the gallery, but to think about them also in their context of what is the visual language of religion at Dura.
Hmm. Thank you for explaining that. So you talked a little bit about persecution there.
Mhm.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, So what this tells us is that one, if so, it was Romans in charge of this town. Is that right?
At this point, yeah. So in
Yeah.
the period of the Christian building, it's a
Okay.
Roman town.
Yeah. So Romans
And
were in
a
charge of this
heavy
town.
Roman military presence.
Uh-huh. And these Romans, like if they would have walked into this building, which they would have been able to do, right, if they wanted to, right? Right.
Presumably, yes.
It would have been pretty obvious this is not a home. Like these people aren't just hiding the Christianity going on here. Like this isn't some
Yeah,
uh
there's no evidence that this was a particularly hidden, the Christianity
yeah,
particularly hidden.
right.
And
So with that
we
uh
do have a lot of examples of Roman military folks participating within local cult life at Dura-Europos. So, for instance, the Roman military was a hugely influential presence in the Mithraeum and
huh.
largely responsible for the expansion of the Mithraeum later in its life. Uh, they also patroned other cults. They also, so th- their presence does not equal persecution, right? We have quite a bit of evidence of Roman military participating in local Doreen cult life, adopting particular customs, right? Depictions of sacrifice. All of this was part of religious plurality and of religious tolerance within Dura-Europos. This is not to say that before 300 Christians weren't persecuted elsewhere in the Roman Empire. That does happen, but those persecutions were largely localized and not widespread in the way that we once thought, right? So it also makes good sense that we might that what is going on at Dura-Europos, where we have no evidence for Christian persecution, also that the fact that Dura's Christian building was once a private home does not mean that Christians were hiding behind the edifice of a private home, as other scholars have argued. They didn't need that here.
That's really, really fascinating. Yeah, so the whole idea of like Roman soldiers, that really does change things if they were going there.
Well,
So
we don't have any evidence. I will say
okay.
this: we don't have any evidence for Roman military presence within the Christian building specifically. We
Okay.
have plenty of evidence for Roman military presence at other buildings, especially the Mithraeum. Why that is, I mean, it could be just a product of the evidence we have preserved.
Yeah, just
But there's
coincidence.
what's there and what's not, right? Who are their favorite gods?
Right.
Maybe Jesus wasn't the favorite god of a soldier Bob over there, right?
Yeah.
So there's different kinds of who you're patronizing, which cults you are a patron to, who has popularity, right? And with them, they brought their own customs and also adopted others. But considering how religiously tolerant this city was, it seems highly unlikely to me that a Roman garrison would particularly care about a nascent Christian community.
I see. But hypothetically, if there was some type of persecution, these people weren't hiding.
There
Like
was
it was
I mean,
obvious.
there's no evidence for that Christians were ever persecuted at Dura-Europos at this period.
Okay.
None, zero, absolutely
Yeah.
none.
Right.
I think
Right.
I think the Roman military was too busy dealing with the Sasanians to care, right?
Fair enough.
They had bigger problems going on.
Oh, those Sasanians. Gosh.
All
All
mean,
right.
they eventually lost the city to the Sasanians, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So probably bigger fish to fry there. This is somewhat off topic, but not really. Is there any scholarly consensus on the existence of house churches? Because it seems like this is kind of throwing a lot of the evidence we did have out. Like we can't use it.
Yeah. So I think I would hope our article does is call this very idea of a house church, this is a distinct type of Christian architecture that scholars have thought was ubiquitous in the period before Constantine, into question. This is not an architectural type we have otherwise attested anywhere else. And what the textual evidence, and I'll cite my colleague Christina Sess's work here, is that we actually don't have this. So the Greek equivalent of, so house church is a translation of the Latin domus ecclesiae, or the Greek oikostes ecclesia. these Latin and Greek terms, right? So we don't actually have anything in the Greek that we can securely place before Constantine's reign. So this idea that scholars had come up with this idea of the house church or the domus ecclesia based on the kind of misunderstanding of the textual evidence. Again, here, this is my work of Christine Sessa, that this was an authentically pre-Constantinian term. But what her work did with the textual evidence was say, actually, we don't have this attested prior to Constantine. This idea, this phrase that we've been imagining as this architectural category doesn't exist prior to Constantine, really. And then what we do have in the textual evidence after Constantine doesn't resemble what we have in the archaeological record at all. This idea of these like private homes architecturally adapted for Christian community use, this is not what that term's describing. And then she goes, well, really where she leaves her article on and where I pick up is this idea that, okay, so we just have this one example in the archaeological record of a space that would seem to seemingly be pseudo-domestic. And what our article does go actually, not even that domestic, maybe not domestic at all. So the textual evidence isn't there to support this use of the category, and the archaeological evidence isn't used to support the category as well. So at that point, why do we have this category at all? And yet you'll still see in textbooks, up until hopefully our article, was this idea that this was a real thing that existed in the ancient world. And it doesn't seem like it existed at all. What you have is an example of many in one city of structures that existed that were adapted then for community use. But they don't bear these trappings of domestic space. They're not houses and churches at the same time. This idea that house church is a misnomer. And I've called it the Christian building throughout our discussion today, because I think this idea of church is also kind of a misnomer at this time. When we talk about churches, and I'm aware when I speak to contemporary communities, that evokes a very particular idea for folks, right? Maybe usually it's a 3-aisled building with a nave and, trappings of these kind of larger, more monumental structures, whereas we have rooms within a building that seem to have particular functions. Does that constitute a church? I would ask my audience and my folks at home to say, what do you mean by church, right? There's not one universally accepted definition of church. If a building where Christians gather together and worship is a church for you, then let's call this building a church. But church also often has its particular kind of architectural resonances as well. And I don't want to evoke those for folks at home, because that's not what the Christian building is. For many people, what they imagine as a church is not what we have in the Christian building. We have, interestingly, discrete spaces for Christian community gathering. And I think it's really interesting to think about maybe what might have gone on in some of those spaces, like people listening to someone on the dais or undergoing baptism. But there's a lot of more work to be done there as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that explanation there. So just for my audience's sake, so what you're saying is, at one point, Dura-Europos was like this idea of like, hey, we have an example of a church and a house, and it's got elements of both, and this is maybe what it looked like back then. But you're saying no, like this category of mixing didn't happen. Like this Dura-Europos, once it was renovated, was pretty much a church. Or church, Christian building, whatever.
What I'm saying is that, so that the renovations to this building significantly differentiated it from the house that had come before and other house spaces at Dura-Europos. I want to be cautious that, this isn't black and white. It's not that you have a house or either something's a house or a church, but all of the kind of architectural and adaptational moves all moved this building far, far away from what constituted domestic space at Dura, and placed it pretty firmly within a context of sacred space at Dura, or within of cult space, if you will, right? So I think that's really important, because when we say house church, we are imposing an idea of what constituted a house onto this building, and it has nothing in common, as we've just said, it had its features made it unlike any other house at Dura-Europos. I think that's really significant.
Mhm. Okay. So if that kind of knocks out that category or understanding of how these things worked in this time period, what does that leave us with? So, like, there's, at least the New Testament texts and Paul talk about some
Yeah,
type of group of people meeting in a house.
and ecclesia, right? They
Yeah.
talk about ecclesia, and that's what those spatial settings were for those meetings. I leave it up to the reader to imagine, but we don't have them archaeologically.
Mm,
We do not have them archaeologically. Were they unrenovated homes that people met in? Maybe. Were they perhaps adapted? Sure. Do we have any archaeological evidence to say what it was? No,
mm,
none. So in that case, this is our first Dura-Europos as Christian building is our first time where archaeologically we get to put our hands on a Christian space, a discernibly Christian space.
mm. I see. That's very helpful. So, in other words, um, it's it still leaves open the possibility that just no renovations, because we wouldn't be able to tell either way, right? If
Yeah,
there's
it's
no renovations
possible.
to his house, we wouldn't know if it's for use
We
for
wouldn't
Christian
know.
assembly.
Or if it was maybe it was signaled in ways of like movable furniture, or there's a million ways. Maybe it's not preserved, right? There's
Uh,
all of these questions. But the first time we can discern
yeah,
the earliest example of discernibly Christian architecture comes from Dura-Europos.
yeah, yeah.
But I leave it up to your listeners. Like I tend to imagine many of the examples, especially in uh, Paul's writings, as probably not renovated, but that's just my assumption. That's not, it's equally plausible that maybe they were renovated, right? But I leave it up to us at home to imagine, right? Until we
Mm.
have more evidence for that.
I see what you're saying. So, because there's not a lot of details, we don't have it from the archaeological record. It's still open to the
We don't have it from the
possibility.
archaeological record and we don't have it from the textual record, right?
Yeah.
All we have is an ecclesiae. Whether those were renovated or unrenovated
Right.
beats me. But my guess, who knows, right? Like,
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Alrighty. And is there anything else on this topic that you think people misunderstand, want people to know about?
what I would love people to know about is just that Dura-Europos is an incredible, incredible ancient archive, not just for the Christian building, but because it tells us so much about how people lived and worshipped in the ancient world.
Mhm.
And that the site has been irreparably compromised in the process of the Syrian civil war, along with the communities who were part of its excavation and who live around it. And my hope is that in the years that come, we can continue to do our part in being the best custodians as a global community as we can for the site. And also, I just want to flag that there is an initiative, the International Dura-Europos Archive, where we're working with linked Wikidata to unite the archives of the different museums that hold the artifacts and archives from the Dura-Europos excavation. So that's the Louvre, that's Yale University's Art Gallery, that's the Museum in Damascus, right? To bring things together so that folks can more easily access them across collections. So this was an NEH funded project, and we're hoping that we'll continue to get funding and we'll continue to do this kind of really important cultural preservation with our partners in Syria and across the globe to make this site accessible to you all at home.
Yeah, that is really interesting how we have so many different artifacts all over the world. They're not just in one place. That does make things difficult, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on here.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a pleasure to talk about something I love so much.
Oh, well, that's awesome. I'm very confident that the people that are watching will find just as much value and joy as watching it. But I really do appreciate it. Was there anything about your other work or work in the future what you wanted people to know about?
Um, I just feel very lucky to get to work with that I get to work with these amazing archives and to put texture onto the buildings I work with. My work now is largely on Egyptian monasteries.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that so much of what we need to do as audiences at home is really think about how people lived, but how we can figure out how people live from their local and contextual evidence and not impose our own categories. So I can't wait. Hopefully with the next project, I'll be able to come talk to you more about that too.
Awesome. That room. I can't wait. So yeah.
The other thing is like what I hope this article demonstrates and what it models is the potential of digital and computational methods to shed new light onto kind of older problems and bring us into a different age of analysis.
Yeah, that's super cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on here. It's been an absolute pleasure. You can check out the article and the description, as well as I'll include the Yale site because it's got a bunch of different, things from and like ways you can look at the site, which is really, really cool. But thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much.